Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One on One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. We are in the middle, and this actually will be the final episode when it airs, on our Women in Writing series. And we've had some really phenomenal conversations with women writing in all different areas, writing wisdom, writing on Tanakh, translating, and they've been really diverse, phenomenal conversations. And I'm really thrilled to be here with Dr. Erica Brown for this Women in Writing series. Dr. Erica Brown is the director of the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership and an associate professor of curriculum and pedagogy at the George Washington University. She is the author of 12 books on leadership, the Hebrew Bible, and spirituality. Her latest book is the Book of Esther, Power, Fate, and Fragility in Exile. It's a pleasure and an honor to be sitting here with you. Thank you so much.
No, the honor is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
I have to say that, again, this is a little bit, it's okay. I'm cool being vulnerable, that whenever we put out books to the world, we never know where they're going to go and who they're going to meet. And I want you to know that they've met me at different stages of life. Mm. And in a much earlier episode in the podcast, when I sat down with my friend and colleague, Nechama Goldman-Barish, she had told this great story where she said that growing up, seeing on the shelf of her home books by a woman named Nechama Leibovitz, she said for her was really inspiring. Like, without even knowing the content, but knowing that there was a woman on the shelf and that they shared a name. And we don't share a name, and we've never crossed paths before this evening. But I just want you to know that from when I was coming of age and hoping to be in the Torah world, that I took a tremendous amount of chizuk from the fact that you were on the shelf, and therefore I was so thrilled that you agreed to speak with me for this particular series, because that's the whole point. That's also part of what I am trying to achieve in a series like this, is to encourage women to write, because for so many reasons, maybe we'll get into or not, there are a lot of challenges along the way that I think are particularly posed for women. And so, first of all, I want to say thank you, because even and the content I also enjoyed tremendously. But you being there and putting out such high level content and Torah has been inspirational. And so, I just want to thank you first.
Oh, that's so kind of you to say. I actually saw an expression recently, and I think about it a lot when it comes to women writing within the Torah world, and that is that women need self-confidence.
Oh, wow. That's great.
What does it mean to see, and I work with a lot of younger female writers to try to encourage them to put down their Torah. And you're right, it's hard, I think women need a lot of encouragement. I think that so far women have been, spending a lot of time teaching and sort of figuring out where they are in the Torah world, and trying to create the elusive work-life balance. And then writing becomes like a tosefet, it's like the side dish, and not the entree. And then, serious writing and output really requires the kind of discipline that it can't be on the side. It's just got to be sort of front and center. So thank you so much. I would say one of the hardships of writing is that you don't get the same feedback you get when you're teaching. Just people's faces aren't there. You don't know how anything lands. And people are surprised to know that you don't get a lot of feedback from readers. And so, I never know if my books get read.
Totally. No, I totally understand that. And also, we write with an imagined audience, and just, you never know where it actually is hitting. So
yeah.
Anyways, here's a live face of someone. So I appreciate it. And
that makes me happy.
You. Okay. So I want us to go back. Okay. I want us to go back a little bit in time, and you can take us wherever you'd like. I really like to start all my conversations in a similar way, because honestly, it fascinates me, and because our journeys as women, I think, also are particularly diverse. And so we're going to really focus on the writing piece today, but I would also like to first hear where did your love for Jewish learning and then teaching, which are not the same thing, where do those come from, or where do you see them generating from?
Yeah, so it's a great and complicated question, and I don't know how much time you have, but
My
I
kids
did
are
not,
asleep. Yeah.
and my kids have moved out of the house, so we're
I
good.
we're good. We're good to go.
I did not grow up in a religiously observant home. I grew up in a home where Jewish identity was very closely aligned with Holocaust survivor identity. My mother was a child survivor. My grandparents were Auschwitz survivors, and it took a year for them to reunite. And when they finally came to America, my grandparents, who were Ger Hasidim, really pretty much left everything and were not Shabbat or Kashrut observant. My family belonged to a conservative synagogue, and for a while I went to a very small Orthodox Hebrew school, and I learned very little. But I did win a junior Jewish encyclopedia for reciting the first paragraph of Shema in 45 seconds. And I learned that the goal of Hebrew school was to read things you didn't understand really quickly. But I was very fortunate that someone in my Hebrew school asked me when I was in fourth grade, "Do you want to go to a Shabbaton?" And I had no idea what is a Shabbaton. And but I went, and I saw something that I really wanted for myself. You know, people singing and closing their eyes and dancing, and a certain values proposition in the lifestyle. And slowly made my way. You know, the choreography of tefillah is very, very hard for an outsider. Keeping kosher when you're young. I became a vegetarian. It was very hard. Keeping Shabbat was probably excruciatingly hard as a young teenager. By the time I was in 10th grade, I refused to go to school on the holidays, and I lost my merit scholarship as a result in the prep school that I was in. So I sort of forced myself on the path, and I went to Frisch Yeshiva for 2 happy years. And you know, I was always a disciplined student, and I'm an oldest child, so you can put that together. And so, you know, I wanted to, you know, I wanted to get good at this, and I had the great privilege of studying Gemara with some amazing people in Frisch, and then going on to Lindenbaum, which was Berea at the time, and that was extremely fortuitous because I met Malka Bina, who was at that point running the school with Chaim Bravender, and she introduced me to my husband eventually. So she really, and I can't even tell you.
She really set you up for life there.
She absolutely, in so many ways, and the gratitude is deep and profound. You know, and I always gravitated to learning. And then the question was, you know, how do you not drown in the sea of Talmud? When I was in the Beit Midrash in that gap year, I went back for a second year. I felt I had this recurring dream that the shelves were falling down on me. I think there was just this feeling I have to master all this, and how am I going to do that? And it's impossible. And at a certain point, I made that switch and understood, no, for Jews, this is a lifelong journey, and it's never about mastery. It's just always about being in the game and being all in. So that's, you know, and then I went on to Yeshiva University, and I went on to do my master's work and my PhD. And it's really using much of the same tools that I began to develop in high school.
Wow. You're starting with a yearning basically for spiritual life. That's what you're describing, a yearning that you felt very, very young, and maybe a yearning that had recurred from a generation before, right? That was sort of recycled or always there. And then eventually that took the form of loving to learn Torah. And when did that translate into teaching? Meaning, was that at the same time? Were you starting to teach already when you were much younger?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I should say that my family also, you know, are Balei Tshuva, that I sort of was the first. And then,
oh, wow.
And my grandfather, whose name is Abraham, started putting tefillin on again at 75.
Wow.
Which is like, I think about, you know, Avraham Avinu, who's, you know, leaves for Canaan at 75. And that was actually, that's also been very, very important. I was very close with my grandparents, and they were formed I know that Malki was very close with her, Bobby, and she knew my grandparents. And, you know, their Jewish core was not intellectual, but it was very important to them that we all went to school and that we all continued learning. And so my father was a teacher, my mother was a teacher, my brother is the Rosh Hashiva of Chappelle's. It's sort of my great grandfather was a Melamed. I think in some way it was part of the DNA. I loved watching Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House on the Prairie. I don't know. I just it was going to be teaching. I had a hot second. I thought about going to law school because I was a philosophy major, and what do you do with that? It probably would have been teaching or journalism, but I do view writing as a form of teaching. It's just a different form of teaching, and I would say so. Both of those things are part of my teaching life.
Yeah, and who would you say were? I'm sure there were many, but if you could pick, just two or something of that sort, formative role models or teachers, whether you knew them or not, that you've sort of felt were formative in that journey of yours, whether the religious observance journey or the teaching journey?
Gosh, there's so many. I mean, there's people like Rav Moshe Feinstein or the Rav, people who influence the way I think about the modern world in confrontation with ancient texts, and whether that's in a responsive forum or whether that's in a philosophical or sort of the parshanut of life and through that Jewish lens. I would say, more closely, and I've been speaking quite a lot about this, that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, my husband's English, and we moved to England for him to complete medical school, and we lived very close to Jews College, and Rabbi Sachs was my master's thesis advisor. And, this was years before I became the chief rabbi, but I got a front seat in a pretty small institution to watch a very gallant teacher who had this background in philosophy and was tackling very, very large subjects. And he was a voracious reader, and he was a versatile writer, and he was relentless. And I think that was a really important year for me. I actually thought I would be a high school teacher. And I applied to the only high school there that I knew had an opening, and they didn't accept me. I think they were a little afraid of an American woman who knew Gemara. That was not of interest. And I sort of fell into teaching adults as a result of that experience. I ended up teaching for a Hebrew University program at Jews College, where I met Rabbi Sachs and where I began to formally study with him. And I would say I fell into adult education, and 32 years later, I'm still in.
Yeah, I definitely remember reading about you speaking about that, the formative relationship that was there. If I'm remembering correctly, also because I think about it so much as well. I'm just in a slightly complicated stage in life, in a good way complicated, but something to the effect of no matter what, someone has to keep reading. Meaning, if you're going to be somebody, and I don't know if this is I'm pretty sure I remember reading it somewhere with you, and it's something that I think about a lot, that if we're going to be teaching others and giving to others, we have to constantly be recharging and keeping ourselves fresh and intellectually engaged. And it's something I know that's so important to me. And it also sets a very high bar. But to constantly be engaged in learning and reading, because that kind of curiosity is something that will simply spill over and enrich everything you do. I remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, I've always say you need a lot of input to have a lot of output. And I think that relationship, I'm sure you had teachers, I had teachers, mediocre teachers who sort of taught the same thing again and again. And, and their reading wasn't on trend, and they weren't really keeping up with the large developments that were happening in the Jewish community. I know very few Torah teachers, frankly, who read sociology. And that was something I learned from Rabbi Sachs, was we don't live in a community that is separate from the world, or even separate from the Jewish community at large, whether that's the diaspora community, whether that's the Chiloni community in Israel, whether that's the Arab population. I mean, we're always living in a context with others. And that relationship will largely be defined by our commitment to knowing the other, and our commitment to also, the project of humanity, which is giving integrity to the other. And I think it's easy to stay insular. I mean, it's so easy. It's really impossibly easy to stay where you are and to serve people who are like you, and to look like them, and to read like them, and to write like them.
There are some people who their capacity or what they're looking for is to stay in that kind of path. And for others who feel that their mission is broader, so obviously there's going to be a charge for them to be broad, right? To live broadly, to think broadly.
Yeah.
I think there's room for people to be narrow, but then that also obviously will mean their influence is going to be narrow, which may be right for them.
Sure. Narrow, but without judgment.
I want us to shift specifically into the writing process. And I'm curious, in all that journey, connected or not connected to the religious piece, was writing something that you always enjoyed, that you always felt flowed for you, or it was at a skill that you had to acquire at a certain point?
So I don't actually have it right at hand, but I have my first formal written piece of work, which I think I was 5 and a teacher typed, which was my observations on each of the seasons, which I have framed. And I wrote a little story that I wanted to be a book called something like Gloaming in the Dark or something like that. And I remember the cover. I grew up in the home of a professional writer. So I grew up listening to a typewriter and get to the end, the ding at the end, and then the pushback. And writing was it's my most comfortable modality of communication, much more so than teaching. It's also the way when I need an answer to a problem, I'll say, I need to type it, right? In other words, that's the way I think and gain clarity. As a professor in university, I struggle with how few of my students are really good writers. And I always try to impart on students that good writing is good thinking. It's like your opportunity to be really, really clear and concise and share. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't, they just don't, we don't emphasize it enough in schools, and we don't emphasize the editing process. I can tell a writer a mile away, when you make a lot of edits, they read them and they're grateful. Right? In Mishlei, it says, like, if you correct a wise person, he loves you. You correct a fool, he hates you. Like, to me, the editor is the ultimate, the ultimate in Tikkun Olam is the editing process of someone.
They're the gift. They're the gift.
Yeah, really devoted to making you better. And I have actually had conversations with a variety of publishers where I didn't feel that I was edited well enough. People are afraid to edit you and you're going, no. I'm only the writer. I service the reader. If it's not clear for the reader, then, this isn't my soliloquy. This is a contract that we make with each other, that I'm going to write something of meaning or interest. And if it's not serving you and you put the book down, then I haven't done my job. And the editor is the person in between that space of reading and writing who helps you figure out how to achieve that objective. And I'll see this in students where, I do make a lot of comments on student papers, and I always wonder, is anyone reading those? Or can I just give you the grade? Because are they just getting to the end of the paper and looking at the grade? But every once in a while, I'll have someone who I can tell this is a person who's gonna do something good one day with the pen.
I have to say, I always read the comments, and I looked at the number last. I didn't really care.
Good for you.
I didn't care, but
I'm not sure I believe you. I mean, I always cared, but
no, I think I had confidence the number was going to be good enough. Do you know what I mean? Like, and then the editing. It's funny what you're saying, by the way, because everyone's living in different eras, and eras pass in 5 years at this point. So I don't know. And time is confusing, but I really feel that in my education, which I don't think was, the hallmark standard of great Jewish education, but it was fine. It was such an emphasis on writing. We had to learn how to write thesis paragraphs, and we broke things. Maybe I was just lucky and had a few great teachers. Maybe it just fell on receiving ears because I liked to write at that point.
Yeah.
But I really remember those skills. But I certainly in the country I'm living in, that's been a issue. It's been an issue for a very long time. Yeah. It's simply not formally taught at all.
Right. I mean, there are people who are professional writers, and it took me 4 books to actually even think of myself as a writer, because I think of writing as a malacha that everyone has to have. It's the same thing as, in my mind, it's just a more intentional form of speaking, right? So being and there are different genres of speaking. There's more formal speech, and there's more casual speech within friends, and there's persuasive speech, and there's different types of writing, and so there's a lot of things to master. But if we created a culture and society where we helped people think that way, and developed, they were constantly writing and constantly being edited, so that that's also an approach to tochacha. Is there people, you criticize them or you supervise someone at work and they become defensive and they become, and I think the nicest thing my editor at Simon & Schuster once said to me is, I've never met someone who is more willing to rework her work. In other words, and what I understood from that was that a lot of people they're stubbornly committed to what they already have. What learning is there in that? There's very little learning in that.
I remember I majored in writing in college, one of my majors, and I remember that the teacher who basically taught us all about writing seminars, in Stern also, I remember this, I don't remember much, but one sentence that I keep with me and take with me everywhere, which is that your sentence that you love the most, that you don't want to change, is usually the worst one. Yeah. And she's like, you should always be very suspicious. She used to call them the pink bunnies. I don't know why, but she always be suspicious of the pink bunnies, right? Because they're usually the pitfall of what you're actually trying to say.
Yeah, and actually, Faulkner, that's a famous Faulkner line about getting rid of your little darlings.
Okay.
Like the things that you fall in love with, and getting rid of them. There's almost everything's up for grabs in the editing.
Okay, so I'm curious also, you really write on a very broad array of topics. And at this point, it's such a prolific series of everything that you've written so far, and I'm sure Bezrat Hashem all that is to come. And so I'm curious also within the writing process, how does a new idea arise? Sometimes is it commission? Is it something that you wake up one morning and say, oh, I have to write a book about that? I'm curious how that process works.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it doesn't have a singular answer. There are things that I feel there should be a Jewish response to something, and if no one's prepared to write it, I'll write it. So I wrote a book on scandal. I did not want to write that book, but it was after the Madoff scandal, and I felt that was something that was important to write, and so I wrote a book on death, and it was easier to write on death than to write on scandal. When I wrote on death, that was a Simon & Schuster book, and that was a commissioned book. And sometimes someone will ask me to do, in the Koren series, would you be interested in doing Jonah or Esther? And then I did Jonah, and then I did Esther. And so that was, those were different. Sometimes something is happening and I feel like we need to respond to it. And sometimes I've been working on a creative Perush interpretation of Shir HaShirim during Corona. I started to teach it. I mean, Corona was really right before Pesach. We're starting to understand and shut down and lock in. And I was joking about, I did a class called Love in the Time of Corona. And then a friend of mine said, there's no women who was in that class. There's no women who are writing on songs. That doesn't make any sense. The woman has such a prominent role. Why don't you write something? And the fact is that that's actually not true. There are women, not plenty, but there are women who've written on Shir HaShirim. I don't know where that book will go. I'm traveling it right now. I was working on multiple projects. But that was really a response to, that was my literal passion project during COVID, was to really take that on.
Some people bake muffins and you write books.
Yeah, I don't bake muffins. I'm sorry, I don't bake muffins.
My mother would send me a picture, I don't know, every other day. Hi, Mom, shout out to you. She might be somewhere in the audience. Was sending me many pictures of muffins. My husband was baking the muffins. Oh, what did he say? He was baking bread?
Yeah. He learned to make challah, and that's a good skill to have. But it's not my skill.
I'm curious also in terms of the process itself. Are you, again, this is a really specific question. Are you someone who writes at night? You write early in the morning? Do you have like a time that is right for you creatively? And also balancing it with teaching is so hard.
Yeah. So I am very vigilant and territorial about my time. You can ask my husband or my children. I think, among the people who are writer friends of mine, who are writing serious books, once a year, roughly, they're all doing similar to me, which is 1,000 to 2,000 words a day. That's, that when the active stage of the writing is sort of, which usually for me is the summer, like I'm prepping right now for June 1st. That's, that's the beginning, of sort of, and Rabbi Sachs, not to compare to him, but he sort of went into the summer trance, right? Which is a very deeply immersive experience. And I think the immersion is really important because at a certain point, this has to be something you're thinking about. You're reading other things and you're filtering them, and you're in the shower and you're thinking. It's just this sort of constant, very, very generative process in the initial writing stages. That doesn't mean there are 1,000 good words a day. Far from it. And there are people who say never share what your writing method is because other people say, well, then I'll do it, and it doesn't work for them, and then they feel bad. But I don't have to apologize for what anyone else does. I mean,
no, of course not.
Do whatever works for you. But for people, almost everyone I know says I want to write a book, and I'll get a lot of phone calls of people who say, well, I was thinking of writing a book. I'd like to make additional income. So after I finish laughing, I try to give them the talk about this is not something that you do for money. But if you are serious about it, you have to have some kind of discipline. If you don't care and it's going to take you 10 years and that's like a Sunday cleaning your garage project, it goes into hate. But if you're a serious writer who wants to get published, you have to be very, very disciplined, and you also have to be extremely resilient. I got rejected for 15 years before someone opened the door. And I want to talk about that, especially with relation to women. I've always had a lot of friends who are published writers, and not necessarily generous on the introduction level, right? And I helped edit a book just as a favor to someone I didn't know well. And I said, oh, could you introduce me to your editor? And he said, of course I can. It would be my pleasure. And within 5 minutes, he introduced me to someone, Stuart Matlins from Jewish Lights, I did 4 books with him. And Stuart was incredibly generous and encouraging. And I don't know why it took that long. And so for me, in mentoring younger people, I just today introduced someone to an agent. I feel like paved the way that, there are a lot of books in the world. Yours aren't the only ones. You're not that important. The field is important. And we need to have women on the shelf, and women can sometimes, especially now we have a burgeoning of scholars. In my day, there were, the Talmud shiur at Stern, the advanced shiur had about 5 or 6 people in it at its highest number. And a lot of women aren't generous with each other. They compete with each other. And there's no girls network, and there needs to be, if you want help, I'm here to help you, but I'd like to feel that if I need help, that I can call upon you. And I would say that some of the women in my generation were liked being distinctive voices. And I wouldn't say that, I think that's something that's got to change. I think it is changing.
I think also that what's underlying that psychologically, if I can be a lay psychologist for a moment, what's underlying that? No, I mean, those are the best kind. Clearly, it's the easiest kind. So there's also it's very commonplace in what are considered to be female professions. This is unfortunately a known stereotype. Okay, right. So let's just take that stereotype and put it into a field that's not quote unquote female. But I think that part of what comes along with that is self-confidence. If people are confident, genuinely confident in what they're doing, they do not have to feel that they're not in danger, right? I'm not endangered because I am helping others go on this path. And I do agree with you that it has to be some sort of combination of confidence, and that I'm not concerned that if others come that I get pushed out. And also a real faith and a belief in that I want others to be on the court with me, meaning what you're saying, I don't want to be alone here, right? I want other people to bring this voice, and it'll now be a plethora of voices. So I'm happy to hear that it's changing.
That's what makes it a field, right? That's what makes it a field. Having a few women here, Po V'Sham, who are writing or teaching, or that's not a field. And I think there's something distinctive. I hope there's something distinctive about the female experience that influences the process of parshanut. And I don't only mean Tanakh parsha. I mean the interpretive process is influenced by the experiences that we have and that make us distinct. And that needs a deep and pervasive expression. And it doesn't get that if it's only, sometimes someone will say something to me like, oh, you write, you must write like so-and-so, just because that's a female scholar and you're, like, I don't call myself a scholar, but, you're a female Torah teacher and they're a female teacher, and they're the same. People wouldn't say that about males. They just wouldn't. And sometimes, it's about the way that you get pigeonholed externally. And sometimes it's what you do to yourself or what other women do internally. And the older I get, the less bandwidth I have for that. Be generous or don't be. That's, this is Torah, right? Torah has to influence who you are at your core. V'hafta l'recha kamocha is not only your neighbor, it's also the colleague, and it's also the person who, more people showed up at her talk than your talk. Okay, you'll manage, you'll learn, you'll grow.
Yeah, totally. I'm taking that in also, and I see it in small ways and not ways that I'm going to share in this forum. And it hurts me. Not hurts me because I'm hurt. I'm saying it hurts me to see that. It's chaval. It's also just unnecessary because it'll still take another, the more women are normalized as being scholars, teachers, writers, whatever it is, the less women will have to fear that their place will be taken. I do think sometimes it comes down a little bit to something you wrote about famously, which I was debating if I should even mention it, but I'm curious talking to you about it, but I don't think I'm going to do it here. But also a dearth of opportunity, right. and that it's difficult to make a career.
Yeah. And
so it's not just only the self-confidence piece, it's also a genuine fear of I need to have a parnassah, and there aren't that many jobs available. Maybe we'll save that. Yeah, there aren't.
Yeah.
There aren't. I know.
No, there aren't jobs available. And I think it's important to say, I have two daughters and two sons and daughters-in-law and a granddaughter. And I hope for my granddaughter that should she want to enter the field of Jewish education on an advanced level, that there'll be a job for her. But there'll be jobs for her only if we make the jobs, right? And we haven't made the jobs. We created the education, but we didn't create the jobs. And so that doesn't bode well for. It's not because I'm being pessimistic. Quite the opposite. I'm in this, right? I bet on that horse. But I also think as a responsible parent and mentor and friend to other people, I can't tell you to study for 5 years. And then you'll be the equivalent of an assistant rabbi for the rest of your life. That's not the path of influence, unfortunately. And I mean, maybe people have to do it so that it breaks the ground. And I'm sure there's a lot of truth to that. And I did get a lot of heat for that, for writing that. And I think the reason, and it's okay.
You still stand by that though, meaning you still feel that, I guess now it's 5 years later. You still feel, I don't even know, but you feel that way.
I feel like there are exceptions to it, and I'm really proud and happy about those exceptions. But I think and maybe that's just always the way it is with a new trend and new phenomena. I mean, I can't even describe to you how far we've come from the days when I sat as an 18-year-old in a Beit Midrash in a basement without heat, and you fought for who could sit next to the kumkum in the middle of winter, so that you'd stay warm. We're in a totally different universe. So for people who say, "Oh, Orthodoxy moves so slowly," I'm like, not what I'm looking at. I think it's
no, not so much.
Yeah, I think it's a sea change, but I think there are structural issues. It's sort of like the difference between racism and structural racism. And people are starting to understand that there are societal structures which create expressions of racism, and there's societal structures which hold women back and create and don't create the possibility for taking this education and this spiritual ambition and doing something with it.
And for you, that means we've veered off the writing piece, but I'm going to allow us to stay here for another minute, purely for personal reasons.
Sure.
No, but in terms, where do you see the women part? We're going to stick to the women, not to the racism, but for the women part, what's the solution is having, I mean, in Israel, let's say, for example, one of the solutions that's brought up on forums that I'm on is how every girls' high school should have a woman who is the Rabbah Beit Sefer, meaning like that's instantly giving jobs all throughout the country, right? Why? Isn't it hilarious that there is a man who is the head of a girls' school, or who is it's the rabbinic figure in the school? Again, I'm maybe saying something. I think everyone listening here largely understands what I'm trying to say, but there's something silly about it, right? We want them to have female role models. There are plenty of them around. You know what I'm saying? Like we have so many, thank God, in certain parts of the country more than others. But and so I'm curious for you, where do you see the structural shift? It's in the formalization of titles.
For me, it's not about titles. I mean, I'm a doctor. Also, I'm mostly interested in Tanakh. That's mostly what I write on and teach on, or other areas of Jewish thought. So it's not like I'm interested in being a rabbi. I'm interested in some aspects of what a rabbi does in terms of the platform to teach, and to also be in people's lives in meaningful ways and during milestone events. But I also think it's very different in Israel. I think Israel, modern Orthodoxy, is thriving. There's leadership, there's innovation, there's creativity. There are expressions of tzionut that are genuine. There's capacity to be sort of deeply spiritual, even neo-Hasidic. And here, I think it's much more limiting, and I think positions are much more limiting. But I'm not talking about titles. I'm talking about jobs. And by the way, there are many learned women who aren't great teachers. They're just not, just like there are many learned men who aren't great teachers, but there are places for them to learn. And so I think the next stage of this is asking some serious infrastructure questions. Look, I want to share with you a book that came in the mail a few weeks ago. The author sent it to me, and I've been mentioning this. It's called Dedicated: The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing by Pete Davis. He's a lovely guy. He's sort of I don't know how old he is, but I think he's a millennial writing for millennials, basically. And I don't quite make the cut age-wise, but
I just make the cut. Yeah.
He wrote this because he describes life for a lot of people as one long hallway with lots of doors, meaning the options are open everywhere and you don't want to close any options. And he says, he talks about how unsatisfactory that is in terms of making a life and making a craft. And he talks about what he calls long haul heroes, people who they're just in this. They're not going to one protest. They're not making one splash. They're not writing one article. This is what they do. I'm in this for the long haul. I know women who thought they were in this for the long haul, but didn't feel that they got the support and the encouragement, and everything was a sort of fight and it was exhausting. So they're not there. I mean, when I think of someone like Malka Bina, she is absolutely a long haul hero for me. She understood and has devoted her whole life to this, decades to this. And those are the people who make changes. And that's why you're talking to me today, because someone saw a future that other people maybe couldn't really attach mamashut to. It was too abstract for them, and she made it real.
Yeah. I mean, I am on the cusp of the millennial world, and I see that it's something we imbibe without realizing we imbibed it. And then you got to your 20s and you realize that life is changing all the time, and no one's staying at work for more than 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's a crazy thing. I'm at the beginning of it. I'm not.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's tremendously challenging, and I think about it a lot for myself. My husband and I talk about it a lot as well, because we've been through shifts for all different reasons in the past couple of years. And I think I will just say on the woman piece, which is that the long haul is is a huge part of it. And another huge part of it is it being viable financially for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Correct.
And even if one has a deep belief in what they're doing and a deep belief in the long haul and sticking it out, and they're not in it for the personal glory, but they really want to do it because they believe that they have what to offer and that this is a worthy, holy field, there's, because of what you said about the lack of infrastructure, sometimes it just becomes not viable for them.
Yeah. And you know what? We're not also part of the challenge, and maybe the possibility of creating a sisterhood of Torah, of serious Torah, is that people are transparent about salaries, right?
Yeah.
And they're able to talk about, and the community at large, right? Is that male teacher getting the same thing as a female teacher is? Are people grown and promoted in the same way? So those are deeper structural questions, and things do have to be viable. Now, maybe for some people, they're willing to take that hit. I've always pretty much written my own job description, which sounds, on the one hand, wow, that's liberating. But I want to tell you, actually, I find it quite terrifying. I'd like to be somewhere where I'm not. Also, I have no designs to be a Rosh Yeshiva. It's like people go to a 1-year program and then everybody wants to be a Rosh Yeshiva and everyone wants to be a Ram in Yeshiva. And I just wanted to think thoughts and write them down and share them with people, and find and in an adult education, it's hard to find that place. It's hard to find that place.
Okay, I want to just ask another question or two about them. I'm going to shift us back to the writing process. We've gone on to the women part, but I still,
sure.
Out of my own curiosity.
Yeah.
I'm curious also about the creativity. You spoke about being very intentional about it, which is something that I think that anyone, when you study writing or learn, it's something that you really realize that people you have to be very intentional about, and it's a discipline, just like any other craft that we do. And I'm just curious, though, if you felt that your creative process or your availability to be creative and write has shifted at different points in your life. If you feel that, or you feel that it's been relatively consistent for you, that sort of this spring, I'm thinking here of like this like ma'ayan of ideas and thoughts I wanted to share, that it's sort of just always been effervescent, or have you noticed that it's shifted over time?
I'll share with you the most significant shift for me. I'm predominantly a reader. I read a great deal, and I read in multiple arenas. And that's like, for me, that's the Mayan, right? The Mayan isn't writing. The writing often is a response to reading and the creativity around reading. And also I suffer boredom. So I wrote a book on boredom. And so I am tired of hearing Divrei Torah that all sound like the same Divrei Torah. I don't like the beginning. I don't like the end. I could play the march of the Jewish cliches and, start and you can finish. And so I'm fighting against that all of the time and trying to deliver something that's new. So during Shavuot, I taught, I was able to do a Yizkor drasha, and I wanted to teach a midrash on Boaz, and I did it as a conversation between me and the angel of death, right? Like, I wanted to teach something that maybe people had heard, but I wanted to frame it in a totally different way, and that's fun for me. That's a lot of fun for me. It's also fun because I write. In the past few years, I've written a lot for non-Jewish publications, but trying to use Judaism as a path of wisdom. And so that also makes me think, like, when people don't have to accept this tradition because this isn't their tradition, how do you make the case for it in a way that touches people spiritually? And I'm not saying that I can do that, but that's certainly an aspiration for me. The big shift for me, first of all, publishing my first book was really, really important. And, getting through all that rejection and then realizing I have something to say. I've written a lengthy doctorate, so I understood what it was to write a book, but understanding what book writing is as opposed to article writing, it's a different, it's a very different, yeah.
Can I ask how, you don't have to tell the specific age, but what decade of life, meaning when were you published for the first time? When did you first come out with your book?
Oh, I want to say in the early 2000s, I think, in the early 2000s or maybe mid 2000s.
I meant in your personal decade, but I can figure it out. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, 2000. I'm going to be 55, so in 2005.
So you were in your 30s when your first book came out?
I had 4 kids. I had a husband who was an emergency room physician. So like making time to write. I'm also you asked me, I'm an early morning person. And so I'm an early morning writer. I took a 7.5-year hiatus to do Daf Yomi in my morning hours. So, that was a break.
Yeah.
But I'll write 1,000 words and I'll stop at almost 1,000, like just over if I'm in the middle of a sentence, and I'll spend as long as I need to get to that number. But I can't write at night. I mean, I'll write articles sometimes at night, but most of the time it's in the day. But I can't remember what book it was. Maybe it was like book 10 in or something. And I just felt like no one reads these books. I make no money writing books. Why am I writing? And I really should stop writing. And I had a really like mashber enoshi, like really profound crisis, because this was my way of communicating. And it was so disheartening to feel that we're also living in a time when people want tweet length ideas. And, so I grew up not in that era, and all of a sudden everything was changing. And then I just said, I'm sort of done for. And I took a break for a little while, and it was so hard for me. It was so painful. I missed it so much. And then I realized, you know what? I'm doing this for my own learning. I learned so much when I write a book, and it's the ultimate teacher. And so I just said, okay, I don't care if anyone doesn't read it. I'm going to write it. I'm going to learn, and that's great when you're writing the book. When you're editing the book and it's a bit of a drag, it's a little harder, but that beginning process, it's falling in love. Wow. That's what it is.
Your books, as I mentioned earlier, they're on such an array of topics. And while I hang out most of my life in the Tanakh world, I'm curious, all of the books you've written about spirituality and daily inspiration and also podcasting, I'm curious what has moved you to write a commentary on a book of Tanakh. I would say that's something that we all there's a natural muscle that exists there for those who are engaged in scholarship, let's say. Okay. But I'm curious where those books and that kind of communication through writing, where did that come from? Was it a need that you saw in the people you were teaching? Was it you felt that you needed it? I'm just curious where that generated.
Yeah, I think in some way, it comes as a response to the aridness I experience in a lot of people's religious practice and moments when I see it in my own. I'll often write something that comes from a deep emotional wellspring, and then try to figure out where in halakha it belongs. So I'll just give you, over COVID, I wrote for the Atlantic and for First Things, and I had an experience of going back to shul for the first time after the lockdown and seeing, it was a Friday night, and I cried so hard that my 19-year-old who was davening next to me said, "Ima, if you don't stop blowing your nose, people are going to think you have COVID." And and I thought about the idea of Daled Amot and 6 feet of distance, and the fact that in a shul we have a certain spiritual social distancing process. So then I just I'm on that, right? It's like something will come together. I'll have a moment. I'll start to think intellectually. I'll intellectualize the emotional moment. And then I wrote a book called Spiritual Social Distance. I wrote an article called Spiritual Social Distancing. And that was, and I wrote a bracha on, I wrote an article on the bracha on friendship as a reunion blessing. And I felt like that was Jewish wisdom, that I thought, like, why save this for ourselves? Like, write this in First Things. It's a journal of religion, widely read, and let people see that Judaism has this beautiful way I never thought in my life I would say Baruch Machai HaMeitim. And there I was seeing a friend in New York, and we're both reciting this over each other and crying. I was like, let's put that out there in the world, and I don't know where to go. But I think that sort of that willingness to, like people wear T-shirts. I'm a writer. You may appear in my book one day, as a sort of like, to scare people.
Yeah.
I think if you're a keen observer of life, and you try to learn a lot, it's sort of worlds come together in really powerful and generative ways. And so, then you just have to sit down on your tuchus.
And they last. And the classes we teach don't have the same enduring value that books do, which is why even in an age of Twitter, I think that the books are still going to have a value. That
I hope so. I think I do teach quite a bit, and I think even if I were to write professionally full time, which, by the way, if I could make a living, I would totally do, but I cannot make a living from it. But teaching gives me a different kind of feedback, and I think when you can teach and write, that's a great, especially if it's around the same topic, that's the best.
So that's sort of how you try and organize it. You're saying you have seasons that you focus on the writing?
No, it's like I watch a lot of professors do that. They'll teach a course and they'll write it up, and they'll write it, teach it, and I'm like, I got to get on that. So I think I'm moving in that direction. I don't know where I was all this time.
I understand very much what you're explaining. My husband's always like, why do you make it more difficult for yourself?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm like, I don't know, because I have to make it diverse and I'll get bored. He's like, who's bored? You're always working. Right. He's like, just put it all around the same topic,
Right. I have had a lot of observations as I've been reflecting on Rabbi Sachs's death and rereading things and talking and teaching. And, Rabbi Sachs did not have, I think, a wider range of themes. He just didn't. I think what made him influential is that he picked what his Torah was about, and he just kept doing variations of that. I mean, they're very sophisticated variations, and the wealth of philosophers and demographers and psychological studies, and he brings a lot to bear. But the themes are almost always the same. And that's been sort of a learning for me this year, is to think, well, maybe the boredom that goes into like, let's write this and let's write that and let's work on this, may be good in the moment, but may in the legacy, in the writing legacy, may be less useful.
And detracts from the sense of it being a canon, almost, meaning that it has a certain.
I don't know if it can. I mean, I don't take myself that seriously.
No, okay, that was too bombastic of a word, right? But I meaning I'll say it in a different example, which is that someone, Alex Israel, do you know him? Who he recently.
I taught him when he was 17.
Oh, so he recently. I don't remember what the context was. I know someone else shared it with me. It was maybe it was on Facebook somewhere, and he shared that. When you would go back and think about what Rav Lichtenstein spoke about, he said every single major drasha he gave always had the exact same bottom line, which was you have to learn Torah intensely. And he said it could be a drasha on Hanukkah and it could be on Pesach, right. Whatever it was, he said the bottom line was always exactly the same. And he was speaking about the importance of repetition when it comes to teaching or parenting, right? If you want to make a point, right. Maybe it's really annoying and even somewhat boring, but to make a point, you have to repeat yourself. And he said even if his students over the years didn't live up to his expectation, they knew exactly what the expectation, what the bar was. The bar was learn Torah intensely. And maybe you won't be doing that right now, but you know that that's what's been expected of you. And so it's an example in a parallel world, but thank
you for that gift.
That's a really important idea. And I think also a little bit because some people it's a personality thing to be bored, and some people it's also the age of it's hard for us to focus on something for too long, which I don't think it's where you're coming at it from, but I'm saying people of the millennials and below, who also bring a lot of great things to the table. I'm not besmirching the millennials. I think they've brought a lot of interesting things to the world.
Yeah, of course.
But in any event, that there is something to be that what we mentioned before about sticking it out for the long run. Also, you're saying might have truth in terms of the themes that one writes about to stick it out in the long run, and that ultimately has greater impact.
Yeah, and I think there are new ways to say things, and that's part of the work, is finding the new way to say things. I also think I haven't always been clear on my own audience, right? Am I writing for non-Orthodox? Am I writing for a general public? I've experimented with different things, and so still figuring that out. Still figuring that out.
It's also good to hear, and for everyone, people look at others who are so far ahead of them and think that, they must have some sort of formula. And it's always important to remember that everybody is all still figuring things out in their own stage of the journey.
Yeah. The formula is to wake up, is to say Modani, is to feel so blessed that you're here, and then to do something of meaning each day.
I have another 75 million things that I would like to talk to you about, but we're gonna have to wind down. I'm looking at my recording and I'm thinking, oh no, how is it over here? I'm just curious if you could give, and I'm sure you do give a lot of advice to a young woman who wants to start off on a path of education in general, and perhaps also writing. I'm curious what piece of advice would you give her to start on that journey?
Yeah, I read some advice recently. I thought, oh, that's good advice. Write 150 words a day and take a 10-minute walk every day. In other words, and see where that takes you, and part of it is the everydayness of it. And you can see, if I can do this, can I do more? You got to put your name out a lot in a lot of different places and a lot of different ways to see what sticks. And someone might reject you and it has nothing to do with you. I'm not the world's most secure person, and rejection comes hard, but we can take it. We can take it. I always think that one of the strongest expressions in Tanakh is v'takamhi, when Naomi gets up after losing everything. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if the rest of this, you could imagine the rest of the story. You might not imagine it in that particular way, but from a storytelling perspective, getting up is a decision when you keep losing, and it's a decision that eventually led to Geula. And I think in writing has a similar sort of framework, which is there's a lot of loss, there's a lot of rejection, there's a lot of insecurity, but there's moments when you feel that, and you got to get up, because you don't know that the next time you try something magical won't happen.
I'm giving myself another 3 seconds to take that in. Yeah.
No, look, that was my conclusion of saying, there the number of best-selling writers out there in the world, just be realistic. That's not going to happen. I'm writing to keep myself out of trouble, and that seems to be a good enough reason.
Okay. I think, are you ready for a little lightning round, Erica?
Whatever lightning round is, sure.
Okay. This I'm going to have to ask us in plural, but what books are? I like to always end my conversations with a number of short questions. Okay, just answer it, associatively. What books are currently on your nightstand?
I have a 5-volume work on art that was put out by the New Yorker. I have Mary Oliver poems and Louise Glick's poems, and Joseph Brodsky's poems. I just finished Starting Out in the Evening. I'm reading another book called, I think it's called Trumpet. It's called Trumpet. There's always a fiction. There's always poetry and there's always fiction. But in the day, I'm almost always reading something on Tanakh. Right now, I'm reading on Kohelet, Michael V. Fox on his book on contradictions in Ecclesiastes. So there's always usually some academic Tanakh book or something like that in the day.
And Tanakh is your is the main part of the sandwich.
Yeah, it's it'll be something in Jewish studies. There's always something in Jewish studies, and then there's always a fiction. And I'll do a lot of memoir, and then fiction, and then some nonfiction. So it's like a rotating thing, but it's a lot.
I'm sorry, I have to just deviate
Yeah.
for a second. Were you also reading at this pace when your kids were little? I'm sorry, I have to ask this question for personal reasons.
I was, otherwise I couldn't be a parent. I also, as a personality, I'm very introverted. And so like, I need a lot of my own sort of, in order to give to my family.
Self-preservation in order to give to others.
Yeah, I mean, I need both those things. But in order to go out and, I don't like noise. So I need a lot of quiet alone time, and then I can go out and, do the noise and then come back.
Okay. Many years ago, we would have hung out in the park. I'm just saying.
Good.
My husband comes home and I'm like, it's very loud here. I really can't. 4 girls, a lot of yelling, less fighting, a lot of yelling. Okay. If you could sit down with anyone, alive, famous, not famous, for coffee or tea or whatever you like to drink, who would it be?
Oh gosh. It may have been someone like Golda Meir. I think I'm interested in adult transformation and how you sort of someone who, really makes a change in life in the way that she did, and dedication and bravery and courage and also fighting demons. That interests me. And just making a practical difference in the world. Yeah, that interests me. I mean, I think that's interesting because it's not something I see myself ever doing. I'm not a particularly political person, so I'm intrigued by people who have that sort of mindset. But I also like to talk to a number of evil people because I just sort of don't know what's going on there. And that would be, I have the good fortune of spending a lot of time with very righteous and good people. And so the other people are a mystery.
You're curious what the other side looks like.
Yeah. Just a little.
Yefeh. What's your favorite tefillah?
I love Hashkivenu. Yeah, I do love that. I would say that the one that I go back to, Atah Chonen, is very important for me. And it's something I think about pretty much like every day, very specifically. The way people add something in Shema Kolenu, like I'm always like seeking divine wisdom in decision making, in intellectual parsing and how to think about an idea. So Christians have an expression to pray on something. So like Atah Chonen is the time when I pray on something. Yeah. That I got to think about. I saw in an earlier conversation, I think it was Shuli Mishkin, she said that during Corona, that's where she was like, I'm not praying for miracles. I'm praying that all of these scientists have a tremendous amount of success in what they're doing and that they are given tremendous amount of death. Yeah, that's a good one. I will say during Corona, I started saying Varastich li leolam every day. And that's been amazing. I'm not stopping with that. Yeah. Something unexpected that you feel very passionate about. Or are all your passions out there for the world to see? I teach a course in diversity to graduate students at GW, and I'm very, very concerned about race inequalities and structural racism in this country. It's not a conversation you can have in the Orthodox community safely or comfortably. But we of all people need to make that our issue. I understand politically there's a lot of intersectionality and why Jews haven't gotten involved, but if we could transcend that, I think there are important things that we actually have to do with our white privilege. So I'm passionate about that. Any hidden talents? Hidden? No. I paint a lot. I can't say I'm good at that, but I do that. Yeah. Is that what's behind you on the wall? No, what's behind me on the wall actually are my book covers, which is something I saw once in Danny Gordis's house, that he had his books and covers. I go, oh, that's nice. One day if I write a book, I'll do that. And but this was honestly just for me. All of a sudden, Zoom brought my own personal study into everyone's world, and so I actually feel quite uncomfortable about it. I probably should just move it this way, but it's hard to get a shot where it's not there. So yeah. You're saying for you, it's motivation. It's motivation for you to keep going. Not motivation, just sort of looking back and saying, like these are things that I've done. Upstairs I have pictures of my kids. Like that's the most important thing that I do, but that I brought into the world. But yeah. Okay. An exotic location you'd like to visit? I would very much like to go to India. I read a lot of novels that are set in India. I love R.K. Narayan and Rohit Mystery and Adiranti Roy. I have a whole Vikram Seth. There's a lot of Indian writers that I like, but my husband doesn't want to go, so I'm just going to have to backpack that by myself someday.
Okay. Could find a friend. There's a lot of Israelis hanging out there, so
yeah, exactly.
You'll definitely find someone to hang out with. Okay, to end this conversation, I'm curious to hear something that you're grateful for in your life right now.
I'm grateful for modern medicine because I think we've spent maybe 16 of the most unusual months of our lives globally. And there's been so much to learn about human fragility and human resilience and human creativity and human innovation, and also human greed and a lack of collective thinking. And, I feel like we have to come out of this better than we came into it. I don't know that we will, but I feel like if we have survived this, then sort of we owe the world the best of ourselves.
Thank you so much for your time and for being so gracious and sharing.
Oh, thank you. This is so much more fun than what I had planned the afternoon.
It's really been quite a pleasure. I just want to thank everyone for joining us on Facebook, whether live or in the future. It's been a real pleasure to be here with Erica, and I'm wishing you all a wonderful evening. I want to thank you for joining me for this series on women and writing. It was such a privilege to sit down with so many talented and interesting women writing books, articles, translating Torah, answering halacha questions. A central point that really stood out for me throughout these conversations was the need to encourage women to sit down and share their ideas with the world. Teaching requires a certain set of skills, and you show up and you do your thing, and then it's over. And it enters the minds and hearts of the people you teach. But there is an entirely different set of skills that are needed for writing, to create that place that you need to gather the courage to go and do that, to have the courage to leave your word out there and have it be in the world forever. And this need really stuck out throughout all these conversations, that it's so difficult for women to carve out that kind of space and to have the confidence that they're worthy of that space. Women need context. They need a time and a place. Everyone needs to develop their own writing practices. The practice we heard about was writing every single morning, or having a certain word count that no matter what you have on that day, you don't get up from your seat until you have reached that word count. And that women certainly need to clear their minds in order to enable this kind of creativity to flow. For some women, this might mean a certain moment in their life, a certain period where they perhaps post-childbearing years, perhaps where there is enough help in the other areas of their life, whether it be in their work life or their home life, that can enable them to focus. I really love that phrase that Dr. Erica Brown earlier in this episode shared, that she called shelf-esteem, that she had borrowed from a book that she had recently read. I think many women really need convincing that their ideas are worth sharing with the world. I personally believe that this need is based in both nature and nurture, but either way, if you know someone, if you have a friend or a mother or an aunt or a teacher who has this potential and who's been sitting with intellectual and spiritual treasures and hasn't yet made the time to share them in writing, please encourage her to do so. Maybe even sit down with her, if she would like, about how to rearrange her life so that she can leave this mark in the world. Maybe even send her this podcast and the others in the series. We'll be taking a 1-week break, and then starting with Parshat Devarim, we'll be posting a 30 to 40-minute shiur each week with a different Matan faculty member. Our plan is to be back with episodes like these, with me as your host, after Sukkot with new one-on-one series, which we will be posting and discussing on the Matan Facebook page as the summer progresses. Before I leave you for the summer, I want to remind you about 2 exciting upcoming Matan events. The first one, which will be held on Zoom, will be on Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, which is June 27th this year. Matan will be holding an international conversation held between Dr. Yael Ziegler and Dr. Erica Brown, and they will be discussing preparations for the 3 weeks, talking about tragedy from a biblical perspective. Join us for that moving conversation. I also want to remind you about the upcoming Matan summer program. The first week-long in-person program is taking place from June 27th through the July 1st. It will focus on studying Israel's flora and fauna. And the second program is a 2-week Zoom program taking place from July 4th through 15th. The classes will be in Israel's afternoon and U.S. morning times, intended to make Matan's learning accessible to our annual summer students who can't physically be with us. We'll dig deep into Jewish FOMO, finding our place within the family of nations. You can visit the Matan website or call the office to register. I want to thank you again for joining me for this series, and please God will be back next year with more enriching, meaningful, and hopefully moving content. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.